Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and let me thank also the organizer for inviting me. This is a wonderful conference. I had heard very positive feedback in the past. I never came, but I see it's really wonderful, so thank you very much. When we think of curiosity, one often thinks about people paying attention for a few seconds to a novel or a surprising stimuli, or a child spending a few minutes exploring a new toy or asking a why question. However, I've been studying curiosity a lot in the last 20 years with many wonderful colleagues, but the way I came to study curiosity was from questions about what happens in human at a very different time scale. Not the moment-to-moment time scale, but the evolutionary and cultural evolution time scale. Around 20 years ago, I was in a lab headed by Luc Stills, where we were trying to investigate and model the origins and evolution of languages. How do we go to ancestors of humans who did not have language at all to ancestors who had some form of primitive language? How also do we go from populations who do not have yet linguistic conventions to the formation of new linguistic conventions? And some of the tools and concepts we had developed at the time involved considering a population of agents which would play language games. So for example, there was the naming game. The naming game is a game in which two agents, like for example those two simulated agents which are kinds of robots on the left, one of them, who was the speaker, would think in its head of a reference in the environment and would try to have the other guess what would be the reference. And so he would say, for example, wabadoo. And the other one, based on what he knew about the language, would maybe this pointing to one of the reference. And then the first one would say either, yes, that's this, or no, that's not what I meant this one. And they could not read into each other's minds, so they had to make hypotheses about what potentially would be the mistake, what potentially would be the conceptualization of the referent. And they would update their internal model of the language after each game. Initially, they had no language or a random language, and then progressively through playing those games 2 by 2 in a large population, they would crystallize and synchronize a new lexicon, a new set of grammatical rules. More personally, I was working actually on the origin of speech, and I was interested in the origins of vowels, syllables, consonants, and the regularities of them in the world languages. And also I had agents play games, and in that case they were imitation games. They were constantly babbling and trying to imitate and reproduce the sounds produced by others, and we had great results both in the lexicon, in the sounds, in grammar, enabling us to reproduce the regularities of languages in the world. But then, if we are interested in the evolutionary origins of those processes, we needed to understand the origins of the ingredients we put in those agents. And there was one key ingredient we would put from the start in those agents, which is that all the day long, they were hand-programmed to play those language games, to play games interacting with others through language. And so one question was, okay, what could be the origins of such a very strong motivation to play those games all day long, and very long before language is actually functional and enables coordination? So one hypothesis would be that maybe in the past there was some kind of evolutionary context in which some pressure pushed the emergence of a very specific motivation for playing with language. But then I started with my colleagues to think about the question of what makes individuals persist in exploring activities they don't master yet. And then this let me take a step back from language and think about how individuals, and children in particular, learn a whole diversity of skills. Infants and children learn how to follow objects with their eyes, how to grasp and to reach objects with their arms, how to locomote in a very diverse ways diverse set of ways. They learn to play with toys in multiple ways. They learn to ride bicycle. They learn to play music. They learn to do math. They learn to do philosophy later on. And all of this requires a lot of practice before they become to be skillful. What motivated them to do this exploration? So of course, social interaction is very important. The social environment provides incentives, models, but still, you need to understand what motivates children to actually imitate. And there are many exploration activities that children do that are not at all imitation, for which there is no easy and direct model. Think, for example, just about very simple things such as following objects with their eyes, or controlling their proprioception. And then the question is there a specific motivational system that pushes them to explore all these particular things? Or is there maybe a more general system of motivation that, as a side effect, may progressively push them to explore this thing and this thing and this thing, and then increase progressively in complexity? And this is exactly what put me on the track and on the study of curiosity. So initially, actually, I was not really considering the concept and the word curiosity. I was really considering more abstractly spontaneous exploration, what pushes organisms, humans, and all other animals to spontaneously explore. But then I discovered later on that psychologists had been thinking of it and using the word intrinsic motivation to speak about that. And indeed, children, they spend an enormous amount of time spontaneously exploring their environment. And they do so in particular very often by inventing their own games, by inventing their own problems. And this is such a strong motivation that they do that even if one tries to put them in a very restricted context where we impose them externally problems to solve, such as the context that have been traditionally used for more than 50 years in psychology and neuroscience paradigm to study the development of cognition, to study learning. So in typical paradigms that have been used, for example, to study child development, so I'm going to give you an example of such a paradigm, which was gently authorized by Lorian Radfischer and Alex Kasselnik, studying the development of tool use. And so here we have a very classical paradigm that's about understanding how infants of various ages learn to use tools or understand tools. Yeah. And so that's one of the right video. You saw something in advance. And so here, basically, the way this setup is done is that the environment is simplified in terms of colors, in terms of shapes, and the experimenter tries to set up a goal for the infant by making the assumption that the infant will be interested in getting a colorful car, which the experimenter is going to put inside a transparent tube, and then a few apparently non-interesting objects are put around, and one is interested to see whether the child will have the idea of using those non-interesting objects to actually get the interesting toy out of the tube so that he can play with it because he is interested with having the toy. And then this kind of experiment is done at various ages and correlated with various other capabilities. And this is actually the outcome of those experiments is what is reported in the papers. But those videos I want to show you are not the experiment themselves, but the making of the experiments, which I believe are extremely enlightening about what children actually do at home and spontaneously. So as you saw at the start of this video, the child seems to do the task pretty well. The experimenter and the mother are very, very happy that he gets the car. So the mother actually seems to be quite motivating to play with the car, but the child takes the car from the hand of the mother and wants to put it back into the tube. So that's pretty strange because the experimenter assumed that the goal of the child would be to put the car out of the tube. So he's trying to do something different. So let's look at this little girl.
We're playing train. Get it out. Can you make the car fall out? Ooh. Yay!
Okay, so technically, what's going to appear in the paper here is that this girl succeeded in the task. But actually, I don't know if you heard that, at the end of the video she said, "Oh no!" And just before she was saying choo, 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 she was actually playing the train, imagining that the car would be the locomotive, I don't know what's the English word, and then the other interesting object were the wagons. And then she was playing with that, and as a side effect, the car fell. It solved the task from the perspective of the experimenter, but it's not what she intended to do. She intended to do something completely different that she invented entirely by herself. And this little guy is an actual genius. So he's saying choke. So this little guy just got the idea that maybe those uninteresting objects can be used to draw, and he tries, and actually it seems that it's working, and he says choke. It's like a choke. And so he's completely ignoring what everyone around is trying to make him do, and he's actually inventing a new use of this object as a new kind of tool. So again, he's failing from the perspective of the interpretation of the experiment as it was designed initially, but he's actually a genius about tools. And so what's very, very important here is that, one, children do whatever they want, and they invent problems even if adults try to invent goals and problems for them. And exploration here is not just a reaction to problems and knowledge gaps imposed by the environment. They are inventing their own problems. I'm coming back to that in a minute. So those mechanisms have been mysterious for a very long time in the history of psychology and neuroscience. We've been knowing a number of things. We've been knowing that being in some kind of emotional state of curiosity facilitates memorization. We've been knowing that children who've expressed in various ways curiosity tend to have a better academic achievement and a better form of well-being. But mechanisms behind this have been very vague. If you look at the psychology literature, which has been pretty rich in the 40s and in the 50s, in the last century, there are many ideas that have been put forward, like the idea that in the brain of children there are neural circuits who are intrinsically motivated to explore novelty, surprise, cognitive dissonance, or intermediate difficulty, like in the theory of flow of Csikszentmihalyi. But if you look closely, all those ideas, they've remain relatively vague, especially if you take the perspective of someone like me who tries to build machines who simulate and reproduce mechanisms that we observe in humans. If you read the text by all the psychologists, they are very inspiring, but they don't really tell you the recipe of how to build a mechanism. It's still very vague. So things have started to change a lot in the last 2 decades. Thanks to a group of people in the world who've tried to gather regularly to think about curiosity and to try to naturalize ideas about curiosity, trying to build explicit hypotheses about mechanisms, to test them in experiments with humans, with machines. Here I'm putting a few names with whom I have interacted in the past, but there are many more names that have been doing amazing work in the recent years. And today in this talk, I'd like to discuss about a few open scientific questions that we've been exploring. The first question is, what are actually the mechanisms of curiosity-driven learning and exploration? For example, what does the brain find as an interesting problem to explore, an interesting stimuli or learning situation to explore? And beyond selecting what's interesting, how does the brain can generate new ideas for new goals or new game? As directions of answers, I speak about the learning progress hypothesis that's linked with metacognitive abilities. And I also speak about what I've been calling autotelic exploration with my team. Autotelic from the Greek auto and telos. Telos, the goal, the capacity of individuals to invent their own goals. And so exploring by inventing one's own goals. Then I'll discuss another open question, which is, what are the proximal functionalities of curiosity? What is it useful for? And what are its developmental consequences? And then here I basically argue that different mechanisms of curiosity are very efficient for acquiring world models and skills. And if you take a long-term perspective, they play a key role in actually structuring development on the long term. I'll give examples in the vocal domain and in the tool use domain. And then another question is, what are the distal functionalities of curiosity? How can we understand from an evolutionary perspective why organisms, much beyond humans, end up having forms of curiosity? Why is it useful for? And actually, I'll give you a very short, but I think interesting insights that having forms of curiosity is actually extremely useful for organisms to survive and reproduce in environments which are hard, where rewards are very rare. And from a machine learning perspective, this means that this is very useful to solve complicated problems where there are many local minima in the search space. And this is the reason why, in the recent decade, curiosity has been used a lot in AI and in robotics to solve actual engineering problems. And finally, if I get time, I may not because I tend to be too long in my talks, but if I get time, I will talk to you about recent work where we've been applying those fundamental insights in educational applications, and which we've been, for example, implementing educational technologies, which we've been experimenting and disseminating very large scale in France to try to train children's curiosity and metacognition. Okay, so everything I'm going to say now is based on a particular conceptual approach to try to understand curiosity, and that approach is the following one. It's to consider the child a little bit as a scientist exploring the world, to trying to make sense of it and to control it. So there is a traditional learning loop, which has been studied a lot by psychology, neuroscience, and machine learning, in which individuals do experiments in the world, they collect data, and based on the data they collect, they progressively build a model of the world and increase their skill repertoires, exploiting errors in predictions or error in control that they might make. In psychology and neuroscience, this is traditionally studied under the perspective where the goal to solve is imposed by the experimenter. But here what we are interested in is what happens when there are no goals imposed externally and individuals set those goals for themselves. And here what we are particularly interested in is a set of modules on top of that where there will be a metacognitive model, which is an internal model where the brain is going to model its own abilities, its own uncertainty, its own learning dynamics, its own unknown in various parts of the world, and then derive various measures of interestingness from this metacognitive model that is going to use to select which new experiment, which new problem, which new goals to try in the future. So the first question is, what's an interesting problem or an interesting goal? This is a question that has been approached from very different people in very different literature. And actually, one of the ways I also got interested into this question was by reading theoretical biologists Varela and Maturana, who are developing the theory of autopoiesis and cognitive homeostasis. And they were proposing an account of learning and development in organisms, from simple organisms to human, where learning and development and exploration appeared as a result of perturbation from the environment. And they were assuming that a fundamental drive of organisms was to maintain both their physical and their cognitive integrity, which is to stay in a domain where they predict and control well what's happening. And when they receive an external perturbation, they react to get back in a situation that they master, predict, and control. That's cognitive homeostasis. The idea of curiosity as trying to fill knowledge gaps that arise in the environment or minimize surprise, such as in the free energy principle proposed by Friston, is a bit similar. In the sense that all those approaches, they kind of assume that exploration arises from uncertainty, perturbations, knowledge gaps that come from external the organism. This is certainly happening very often, and this is an important mechanism, but again, when we observe children, they don't wait perturbations. They go for perturbation. They self-perturb themselves. And so another way to conceptualize exploration and curiosity is to think about the organism organizing its own perturbation to learn about the environment. How does it do that? Is it actually searching for high prediction error, high novelty, such as we could think of intuitively? Well, maybe not. Actually, if you try to build a machine, a robot, for example, that's programmed to explore problems with maximal prediction errors, for example, it will do very strange things. You might find, for example, your robot in front of the window and all the day long doing strange, complicated movements like this. The advantage with the robot is that you can open the brain and see what's happening in all details. And what you might discover is that it's trying to predict or control the color of the cars or of the shirts of the people and cars passing by in the street. And he's doing exactly what you asked for. That's a situation where all these movements actually do not enable to control and predict very well the color of cars outside. So it's always predicting prediction errors. So he's doing exactly what you asked. But of course, this is not really what you really wanted, because he's not going to learn anything useful doing that. So going for high prediction errors in complicated, large environments is probably dangerous, leading to lose one's own time. So another kind of idea that's a bit more nuanced that has been proposed by a number of researchers, starting from Berlin, is the idea that maybe the brain likes situation of intermediate novelty or intermediate challenge or complexity. So that's intuitively appealing, but again, when you try to build machines that follow this idea, and the world is very, very complicated, there are millions of things to learn potentially, and the spaces are complicated, what's intermediate? When you think about intermediate, you need some reference points, like the low end, the high end. What are they? If you didn't explore yet the world, it's not very clear. And so that's why, with some colleagues, we came up and developed another idea, which is the learning progress hypothesis. And the gist of this idea is that what's interesting for the brain are goals or learning situations where there is a lot of improvements in prediction or control. So imagine, for example, a situation where you have 4 different problems or 4 different situations one could explore. Imagine that one could take a lot of time to explore each of them independently, and the learning curves, the evolution of errors that you would see are like this. The blue activity would start very easy, low errors, and stay very easy. And then you have 3 activities that start pretty difficult. One is the red one that stays very difficult, no improvement. Maybe it's a bit like the robot trying to make movements, predicting and controlling the cars in the street. And then you have 2 other activities such that as time goes on and practice is made of them, some progress is made, and some progress is made with different speeds. And so the idea of the learning progress hypothesis is to focus at a given moment in time on activities where the derivative is maximal. And so, of course, in the real world, you don't know in advance the shape of those learning curves. So at the start, an individual should just sample a little bit those different learning activities, try to make quickly and efficiently an estimate of the learning dynamics, and then quickly spot that in that particular case, it's initially more useful to explore the black kind of activity, which is a better niche of learning progress. And after some time, the plateau is reached, and it's more useful to automatically switch to the green kind of activity while avoiding the activity which is either too easy or too complicated because they don't provide any learning progress, any derivative. So here we are not actually computing a notion of intermediate complexity that enables to avoid too easy or too difficult things. We are only computing the derivative and we try to maximize it. And as a side effect, it makes the system avoid the activities that are too easy or too difficult. And then also at the same time, it's going to produce naturally a sort of curriculum where the organism will focus first on the challenging but fastly learnable activities, and then shifts to progressively more difficult learning activities, potentially reusing building blocks it has learned in previous activities. And then finally, I just described the learning hypothesis in a bit simplified way because I said what's interesting is the improvement. What's actually the full learning progress hypothesis, what's interesting is the absolute value of the learning curve, of the derivative of the learning curve. And why is it important is that very often for individuals, animals, learning in the environment, their performances decrease at some point in some activities, either because they forget something or because, for example, the environment has changed. For example, their body has changed. When infants grow up, their body changes pretty fast at some moment, and sometimes there are skills that they would master before that they don't master anymore because their body is different. And so it's important for their brain to realize that here there is something where performance has decreased. And this is a very important signal to say that's interesting to re-explore. Okay, so said it another way, the learning progress hypothesis works in a way that's somewhat different from more traditional accounts. Traditional accounts basically say, for example, there is something in the brain that tracks novelty or complexity, whether it's intermediate or not, which is kind of triggering a state of curiosity, a form of emotional experience that we call curiosity, which is, by mechanisms we don't fully understand, facilitate learning, memorization. But the learning progress hypothesis says that there is actually a feedback where the learning dynamic itself is providing the signal, or one of the very important signals, to actually trigger the generation of pleasure molecules in the brain that are leading to the state of curiosity, to the experience, the positive experience of curiosity. And this involves metacognitive skills to be able to actually represent accurately the learning dynamics. And metacognition is kind of challenging and develops progressively in childhood. And that's why actually, even if the principle of that mechanisms might be at play right from the start in infants, it might not be extremely efficient right from the start because there are some modules, for example, metacognition, that might not be fully accurate. And that's actually one of the reasons and one of the bases of some of the educational intervention we've been doing in the past. So first, can we design experimental paradigms to test some of the predictions of this theory? And so in recent years, we've been working especially with Jacqueline Gottlieb, trying to design new experimental paradigms that enable to assess some of the predictions. And here the paradigms are paradigms where we do not impose one problem to individuals, but rather we are going to design a set of potential problems that visually look very similar, but they are designed such that they have a difficulty and a learning dynamics, an underlying learning dynamics that's different. So in that case, for example, these are little monster games where individuals need to learn which food members of particular families prefer to eat. And what they prefer to eat depends on various features of their body. And so that's basically a classification task. And then there is one family which is very easy to learn, two families that are more difficult to learn, but still learnable. One is more difficult than the other one, and one family which is random, so it's impossible to learn. But all this is not told to the participants. They basically say, you have 30 minutes in front of you, explore just as you want. We won't measure whatever you do. We won't compare you to others. We won't do a test at the end. You're free to explore. And then we have also another group where we actually give them a high-level instruction, which is actually maximize learning. We tell them, try to maximize your learning, and at the end we will test you on all games, and we want you to have the better average. So it's kind of asking this population to behave by maximizing the objective that we believe is driving curiosity. And so we studied the outcomes in two ways. First, we did a qualitative analysis. So I'm not going to enter in details because I have a lot to say, but just as a summary, what we discovered is, first of all, that among the free exploration group, there is a significant subgroup which behaves qualitatively very similarly than the group which is explicitly said to maximize learning. And actually what they do is even a little bit smarter, in the sense that the group which is said to maximize learning is going to spend a lot of time trying to explore the unlearnable activity. So they are over-challenging. While the group who is doing free exploration, the subgroup doing free exploration in this case, is actually going to organize itself a little bit better still being trapped a little bit by the unlearnable activities, but less than the externally motivated group. And then there are actually diversity also in individuals, because there is 2 other subgroups of individuals who are actually pretty far from exploring and learning optimally this set of games, either in the externally motivated group or in the one which is freely exploring, maybe for different reasons. Some of them might actually prefer just play with easy things, and that's an individual difference. And some of them, especially in the external motivated group, seems to not be able to regulate their exploration and learning correctly and being overtrapped by the unlearnable activity. Then we did another kind of analysis where we developed a computational model trying to account and find what's the utility functions that explain best the behavior we observe in the subjects. And what we found is that utility functions that explain best are actually combining a component of learning progress and a component measuring prediction errors. And interestingly, we feed the model for each individual, and for most individuals, the combination of those 2 components is the best explaining models, but the weights of those components can vary a lot. And actually, with this model, we can see individuals who actually explore driven a lot by learning progress and are pretty efficient at actually organizing their exploration, and others who are kind of more lazy and are aversive to high prediction errors. But overall, those 2 components seem to be present, and that's interesting, as there might be a synergy between the 2 ones. Learning progress is especially effective when, at some point in time, the individual has already discovered some activities which provide progress. But earlier in exploration, or when at a point in time where no activities at all provide learning progress, then relying on prediction error might be useful as a heuristic to avoid easy tasks and explore new ones that are more promising for learning progress. So this was an experiment, but this experiment is not isolated. There are other researchers in other labs who have designed similarly structured experiments. So for example, there is the team around Francesco Poli, who I know is here, and who's been extremely prolific in the recent years in designing variations of this family of experiments, reaching very similar conclusions. So for example, in this paper, there were infants, 8-month-old infants who are showed visual patterns on a screen with different learn abilities and difficulties. And they were able to show that the engagement correlated with learning progress, but not with surprise and not with prediction error. In another paper, which were a little bit more the task, the paradigm I just described before, they tested 4 years old in a free exploration of various tasks. And again, they modeled and identified that exploration decision depend on a combination of learning progress and novelty, which is very related to what we found in our experiments. And then in the last experiment with adults, basically they found very similar results. Other labs, for example, the lab and the work around Sayali, Elling and Cools, actually found in related experimental paradigms that the flow experience, subjectively measured by questionnaires, actually correlated with learning progress. And recently, there is also a very interesting experiment by the team around Julia Leonard, who designed an experimental setup where 4 to 6 years old had to explore different activities, and they tweaked the system so that they could actually provide learning progress feedback that were kind of false, but so it means that it was very controlled, and they could independently control the percentage correct and the prediction error, and they showed that children who are given evidence of their learning progress persist more on challenges tasks, and this is independent of the final prediction errors. Okay, so far so good. So a number of experiments with humans, various ages, various populations, show that some of the predictions of the learning progress hypothesis hold. Now, those experiments are still in an environment where the number of potential goals is very limited due to trying to do statistics in the lab. But in the real world, infants are in a large, open, complicated world. And how can they explore that world with the learning progress idea in such complicated environments? And also, in those experiments before, those experiments last a few minutes, 30 minutes, 1 hour max. But what happens if we put a mechanisms of curiosity like this in large environments and in a very long time scales? When we zoom out, what we do observe? This we have been exploring with computational experiments and experiments with simulated or real robots in particular. So very, very quickly, just to give you a very raw intuition of how those experiments are going to work. So I'm going to have robots who will explore sensory motor spaces. So for example, it might be a vocal space where goals might be imaginary auditory trajectories in a very complicated auditory trajectory, or it might be imagining a particular configuration of objects of the world that they might want to reach. And so this producing a pretty large goal space. And then there is a mechanism that's going to progressively enable those artificial agents to subcategorize that space of potential goals. And for each of those subcategories, try to estimate the speed at which they are going to master, predict, control those kind of activities. And then there is a mechanism called a multi-arm bandit in machine learning, which is going to sample goals in regions of the space of goals with a probability that is basically proportional to the expected learning progress. So now, what do we observe if we put that in a context? Here, that's a model of vocal development. So we put in a simulation a pretty realistic model of the auditory system, of the vocal tract. And we build an environment where we have a baby vocal learner, which can either babble by imagining its own goals, or there are also simulated social peers who have an already established and structured set of speech sounds. And so what do we observe when we run the system? We actually observe the self-organization of developmental stages with a certain structuration. And so typically what we observe is that initially we found that agents try to set goals which are in terms of producing phonation. Actually, most of the movement of the vocal tract don't produce sound at all. So they try to produce sound. And then after some point, they start to set goals which are about producing what we call unarticulated sound, which are sounds like ar, 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 like this. And then at some point, they start to complexify the kind of goals they try, and they try to do things like ar, ba, ma, ba, ba, da, 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 which is basically what people call the canonical babbling. In the first phase of their exploration, while they have the opportunity to try to imitate the sounds, the structured sounds of their social environments, they don't do it so much because these sounds at this point in their development are too complicated for them, and so it does not drive them to, it does not lead to learning progress. But at the stage when they reach articulated, the stage of spontaneously exploring articulated sounds, at this point, they have acquired sufficient skills to make progress towards imitating the environment, and they shift suddenly to imitating the sound of the social environment. And this progression is the typical progression that has been known for a very long time in the vocal development of children in the first 10 to 12 months. And also, interestingly, is that we know that in infants, there is also a lot of diversity, regularities, and at the same time diversity in the vocal developmental trajectories. And if we launch such simulations many times, and we do statistics about the developmental trajectories that arise, we find the same phenomena. We find that there are typical trajectories, such as the one I just described, that come very often, but sometimes some individual end up actually having a very different vocal development trajectory. And it's not because they use a different mechanisms. It's not because actually they even use different parameters. It's just that the process is stochastic. As I said initially, for example, they have no idea of where to make learning progress. So they sample a little bit. Because the space is pretty big, sometimes some individual will sample by chance a little bit more in one direction, and they will discover something that makes them do progress and will act as a stepping stone to further progress in that direction. So there will be a snowball effect. But others will have a snowball effect in another direction. And the sensory motor space is structured with nonlinearities, which make that there are directions which are more likely to lead to a snowball effect than others. And this is this combination of the stochastic curiosity-driven exploration process and the mathematical properties of the sensory motor mapping, which leads to the emergence of developmental trajectories with a combination of regularities and diversity at the population level. So I'm going to accelerate a little bit. So just a word, we did the same kind of experiment for modeling tool use, finding similar progression, for example, as has been found by in tool use development literature. We did experiments also, such as this robotic experiment who was done a long time ago. Actually, this was actually 20 years ago. And in which this little robot in the center was exploring his body, its environment, and there was a social peer put in the environment who was pre-programmed to actually imitate the sounds of the baby robot when the baby robot would actually look at the other robot and produce a sound. Initially, the robot does not know nothing about the environment. So, for example, here he's trying to vocalize, trying to look at the physical object. No response. We know, but it doesn't know at the start. So he tries these various kind of things. He discovers he makes no learning progress in this kind of stuff and shifts to trying other things. For example, using the leg, as you just see here, which is a better source of learning progress. But later on in the exploration of this robot, he discovers that producing actually vocalization directed towards the other robots leads to a very structured interaction. And this leads him starting explore the social interaction and the imitative cycle with the other robot. Like, and so here, the curiosity mechanism is a step into exploring in a motivated manner the social interaction. We explored further this idea with other simulation where this time the social peer was programmed to actually react in a more complex manner to vocalization of the learner. And when the learner would actually vocalize a sound that looked like one of the names of the objects, so actually the names of the object were pronounced by the social peer when the baby would touch one of the objects. For example, the baby would say, oh, would do that by chance. And the social peer would say, oh, you touched the mics. And so he would hear the sound, and he could choose the sound as an example of a goal to try. But then when the baby would say mic, first trying to produce the sound, then the social peer will actually take the mic and put it in front of him. And through curiosity again, this baby robot will discover here that the production of speech sounds can be used as a tool to manipulate the behavior of the social peer, for example, to get object closer so that it can play with it. And so that's basically the discovery of the functionality of speech as what we call language. And then based on the discovery of language, language can be extremely powerful as a creative tool for further exploration. That's an idea that has been proposed a lot, for example, by psychologists like Vygotsky. And in all experiments I presented so far, goals were actually relatively concrete and low level. It was basically potential configuration of visual objects or trajectory of visual objects or imaginary sounds that agents could do. But if you look at children, they invent much more abstract goals and games. How could they do that? How could they creatively invent those new goals? Language is an amazing tool because of its combinatorial structure. It's conceptual and its combinatorial structure. So for example, imagine this little girl. She comes home after school and she wants to have fun and to make a drawing. And she says, what could I draw? I just saw my cat. I came from the school in bus. Oh, what if I drew a cat bus? She might not be the first one getting the idea, but still that's pretty creative, and that's thanks to language. And this idea is actually something we've been trying to explore in the last few years, again with computational modeling. So this is a very simple experiment. So this environment is actually a little bit like Minecraft, much less beautiful because we are not a big company, so we don't have the graphic designers. But in the logic, that's really like Minecraft. That's the agent here is the little hand. It's an environment where it can take objects, combine them. Here there are pieces of food, pieces of water, which it can bring to animals, to plants, which then can be grown. And in the first phase, these agents explore a little bit in a relatively unorganized manner. And there is a social peer which is simulated. And again, when the agent is doing something that is relevant from the perspective of the social peer provides a linguistic description of what the learner has just done. And during this phase, this enabled the learner to learn a multimodal language model. This was actually done before the advent of the big language model. So here it was a small language model, but it was a multimodal language model. And this language model is basically a model that's going to learn the match between a measure of fit between behavioral trajectories and linguistic descriptions. And this is going to be extremely useful for several functionalities in a second phase of the experiments, where now the agent is alone. There is not anymore a social peer. And he might explore by generating new goals. How might it generate new goals? He might have seen, for example, several sentences provided by the social peer in the first part: grass red tree, grass red algae, grow blue algae, and then recombine the word following the learned language model is been learning to form a new sentence that has a relatively good probability to make sense because it follows the linguistic rules. Not sure, but it's probably a good way to try. And then he's going to try reach that goal. And if he is alone, he needs to be able to provide for itself the feedback for how he's going to reach that goal. But the multimodal language model can be used for that because it's a measure of match between, again, as I said, a behavior and a sentence. And if we use the appropriate neural architecture that can generalize, this agent is actually able to measure the match between a new goal and a new trajectory is going to produce, and use that as a signal to self-progress and self-improve over new linguistic goals that he has imagined and were never pronounced by the social peer. So I won't give you the details, but we have many measures, including machine learning measures, showing that it enables the agents to learn very efficiently a whole diversity of goals that were never expressed by an external social peer. Okay, let me shift quickly now to another question, which is, okay, we've as a summary, what we've just seen is that curiosity-driven exploration driven by learning progress, when it's operational on a long time scale, it self-organizes developmental trajectories that are very structured and that share many similarities with human development. Now, how can this be efficient? Let me show you this experiment with another robot. That's a robot which is initially given a set of motor tools to explore the environments, which means, for example, he has some kind of pre-programmed neural system, which is a set of dynamical systems in which he can send numbers, which are motor commands, and it's going to produce movements, but initially does not know what movements those things are going to produce. This robot is also given a set of perceptual primitives, enabling it to perceive where objects are, what are their trajectories, for example, in the environment. And it is giving a learning system enabled to detect regularities between movements it tries and movements of objects in the environment he observes. And then it is provided a system for learning progress-based autotelic exploration, which is basically first he is given a language for a formal language for generating goals, which is here in that case trajectories of various objects in the environment. And then he's given mechanisms to focus on sampling goals, which at a given point in time maximize its learning progress. So here is the video of how this experiment works. Sorry, here is there a way to remove the sound? Because you don't need to hear the... Okay, sorry. So there is a sound, that's a nice French stuff, and that was not intended, sorry. But, so what you see initially is that the robot, again, he knows nothing about the environment. Initially, it tries many different kinds of goals. For example, it tries to move this faraway toy, which is controlled by the joystick, but initially it's too complicated to learn. He's setting goals about moving these lamps, but it's too far away to be moved for the robot, but he doesn't know. There are also other objects in the environment that move by themselves, other toys, other robots, that he might set as goals. They don't provide learning progress. There is one thing that provides easy learning progress at the start. It is its own hand. Initially, its own hand has nothing special. It's just an object among others in the environment. But this is the first thing in its sensory motor flow for which at the start he is able to make progress in control. So that's also a way to understand how a primitive notion of self can arise as a side effect of conceptualization based on learning progress. And then progressively, by exploring the hand, he discovers that there are other objects in the environment that can be controlled and be learned to control, which are those two joysticks. One of them does nothing special, the other one actually controls the other toy that is in front of him. And at this point in time, he discovered that trying to set goals about this white toy is actually a source of learning progress and focuses on it. And then as a side effect, it leads this robot to discover that actually the white toy can be used to push this ball in various directions. And suddenly the ball becomes a source of learning progress and becomes, and goals about moving that goal becomes to be selected. And so in a few hours, the robot discovered various ways to play with the ball, including, for example, here completely hiding the ball, which was actually not planned. Okay, so now take a different perspective. Imagine you are an engineer. I know you are not an engineer, but imagine you're an engineer, and the only thing that's interesting to you is building a machine learning algorithm that's going to enable this robot to push the ball further away in a particular direction in the most efficient way possible. At the time we were designing this and we were making this experiment, it was around 2016, 2017. It was the start about the deep reinforcement learning revolution. It was the time in which DeepMind was working on AlphaGo, on DeepQ learning, solving the first video games. And you would say, these are the state-of-the-art algorithms in machine learning. Let's use them. And what you would need to use those deep reinforcement learning algorithms is define an external problem and an external reward for this robot. And here, the way you would do it is you would say, if the ball moves 1 centimeter, 1 point, 10 centimeters, 10 points, 100 centimeters, 100 points, 0 centimeters, 0 points. And then you would launch those algorithms. If you would do that here, you had to wait relatively millions of years before those algorithms would solve this particular problem of moving the ball. Why is that so? Those algorithms, they are extremely powerful to refine action policies which are already working more or less, where you get a little bit of signal that is working a little bit. In AlphaGo, for example, when DeepMind trained the system to play Go, there was a lot of signal. Why? Because they use self-play. And in self-play, the system was initially playing against itself, and even by playing random moves, after some times, regularly, one of the two systems would win. And this gives examples of winning strategies which can be leveraged by complicated optimization mechanisms to improve. But here in that case, you cannot really do self-play, and what you can only do is use the algorithm that were used at that time, and when they have no idea of no examples of policies that get a little bit of reward, here move the ball, they just do random action selection, random movement. Here the probability, if you do random movement, to do a movement that's going to do the right movement of the hand, to do the right movement of the joystick, to do the right movement of the white toy, to do the right movement of the ball, is very, very, very small. And so what's the conclusion? Rather than focusing on trying to maximize the specific objective, you will fall in local minima if you use traditional machine learning methods. Forget about this objective. Consider a much larger space of goals, including that one, but many, many other ones, and be free to explore that space of goals, be curious, and the principle you use, ignore the reward, focus on the learning progress you are measuring. And because there is structural coupling in the environment, the robot will end up, after just a few hours, actually solving the goal. Now take a little bit of imagination and think that maybe we're not talking about a robot, but an animal who is in an environment where food is very difficult to find, where food place is changing regularly, so you cannot really learn a genetically hardwired behavior to find the food because it's always changing place. And the environment is dangerous. So what's the best strategy? You really need to find the food to survive and to reproduce, and so that your species is going to survive. Well, what this tells us is that if it's really difficult to find and the environment is changing all the time, if you want to survive, you'd better forget about the food for a while and be curious and explore in a very organized manner the environment. And so that's actually the reason why a number of groups in the recent years have started to think about the evolutionary reason why such kind of curiosity might have arisen. That's the reason why actually engineers also took up the idea. So after the machine learning community began to know about this work about curiosity, they've been systematically integrating them in many deep reinforcement learning systems. This is the way, for example, complicated video games that were resisting the first generation of deep reinforcement learning systems could be solved. And there was actually recent work, older work, doing literally evolutionary simulations where the reward system were evolving and showing that in those difficult environments, what I just suggested actually happens, which that curiosity naturally emerges here. And I will stop here. As I predicted, not being able to talk about education, but you can come to me after and we can discuss. I'll be happy to discuss that. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so we have a little time for questions. We'll, as usual, prioritize any junior researchers who have questions, but keep your hands up just so I know you're there.
I'm sorry, I'm not junior. I'm wondering, can we train children's curiosity and metacognition?
Okay, thank you. So I'll try to make a short answer, but we make the bet that yes, and we took several approaches to do that. One first approach, we took it by trying to build systems which actually facilitate curiosity-driven learning of disciplinary skills like mathematics or languages, leveraging the theory of learning progress I presented. So the thing is that you would say, since children are equipped with those systems of curiosity, they might be actually well qualified themselves to organize their own learning, for example, in the classroom, instead of the teacher giving them various kinds of exercises and various kinds of lessons in a given order. And this is letting them do that by themselves might be probably more efficient. But as I said at the start, to do that efficiently, you need a good metacognition. If you have a wrong estimation of your own learning progress, you will explore in a very non-optimal, even quite disastrous manner. If you let the teacher set the sequence of exercise the same for everyone, it will also probably not be very optimal because each child will have his particularities and its own learning dynamics, and it will not be adapted. So what we did is actually try to use the exact same kind of algorithms I showed that enable robots to build their own curriculum by identifying which kind of goals maximize learning progress. But here, to select and to identify exercises that maximize learning progress for individual child learners, for example, in mathematics. So here, basically, what we're trying to do is we're kind of shortcutting potential limits in metacognition to try to present them exercises that actually maximize their learning progress. And so we did actually pretty large-scale experiments in schools showing that doing this is not only more efficient in terms of their learning that hand-design pedagogical sequences, but also more motivating. So I'm not going to get into the details because it would be long, but we use various tools to measure various forms of motivation, intrinsic and extrinsic, and we could show that it's also more motivating to them. And this kind actually of system, we've done it for a number of years, and now it's actually used in very large-scale educational systems that are disseminated by the Ministry of Education in France. Another approach is, instead of getting around their limits in metacognition, directly trying to train them becoming better in various components of the curiosity cycle. One approach to do that is to train them to ask curious questions, to ask divergent questions. And we've developed relatively simple exercises where we present them short text about dinosaurs or volcanoes, and we give them hints helping them to ask questions that are related to the text, but where the answer is not in the text, and questions that are ideally relatively complex, which means which answer requires an explanation. That's not a yes-no question, for example. And we compared various approaches, for example, training them by only giving them syntactic cues, or providing examples of knowledge gaps, exposing potential knowledge gaps they might have, and so training them for a while, and then after that, seeing how they behave in an environment, for example, where they could explore various materials, and we say them, to explore these new materials, if you want to see it, you need to ask a curious question about it, and here we don't give cues. And we discover that approaches where we give them semantic cues, exposing semantic knowledge gaps, enable actually to develop their capability to ask divergent questions, including when they don't have cues anymore, both on the syntax and on the divergence. Yet, in this first set of experiments, we did not manage to change something very worrying in children's classroom, which is their negative a priori towards curiosity in the classroom. We observed in our classroom, but colleagues in other labs and in other schools in other countries also observed that children in primary school have a very negative view of the behavior of asking curious questions in the classroom, and more generally about curiosity. And here, the intervention we had left their a priori very negative. We did another intervention where this time, before those exercises, we did some kind of metacognitive workshop with a declarative training and a procedural training. And in the declarative training, we simply showed them a number of videos we designed, explaining them what's the concept of curiosity and intrinsic motivation, how it relates to learning, what is metacognition, how metacognition and learning relates. Very simple explanation. And then a few exercises. And through this workshop, we actually managed to change their perspective on curiosity. But this was not at all trivial. We had to really work hard to do that.
Thanks for a really inspiring talk, Pierre-Yves. My question is about the learning progress hypothesis, and you showing that individuals should seek out, if you have these 4 scenarios or 4 situations, pick the one that enhances your learning progress. But I wonder what you think about also biological relevance. So if all that differs between these scenarios or things is learning progress, but for an animal, one of them is really not going to be that useful, it's something really random. Have you considered how you might be able to think about biological relevance in that scenario and how important it is to make correct learning progress?
So I'm not sure I fully understand your question. One way to understand the question is, do we know particular neural circuits who might actually be able to compute learning progress, and is it related to circuits of rewards, like the dopaminergic circuits? And here, not in my lab, but there are other labs who have actually found first bits of evidence showing that dopaminergic circuits actually encode learning progress by itself. And it's actually pretty simple also to implement neural networks that compute learning progress. That's not a complicated computation. It's basically, you need to have a model of your prediction error and being able to keep somewhere a representation of what the prediction error was a little bit in the past, and to compare the two things. But that's not very complicated. That can be really implemented by relatively simple neural systems. And then maybe another way to understand your question is it functionally useful to organisms? So this is what I try to explain. So for organisms who live in a very stable environment, where exploration is not so much an issue, there is not a big reason, a big evolutionary reason to have sophisticated curiosity mechanisms. For organisms who live in environments which are non-stationary, and where there is a lot of local minima to explore, they need forms of curiosity. And we know that simple forms of curiosity, like searching for novelty or maximal prediction errors or maximal surprise, is going to be very inefficient. You need to combine that with more sophisticated things like learning progress. I don't know if it answers your question, but
Thank you.
Hi, over here.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I was particularly stimulated by what you said towards the end of the talk when you described the study with the robot and the arm. And you said, well, forget about specific objectives, forget about having a clear end goal, and instead focus on exploring freely the state space and then see what happens. And when you said that, I realized, okay, so then here, finally, I see a case where predictions are not the key ingredient, maybe, because I don't have a clear, end goal, and I have to take the path that leads me to that final end goal, and then I use predictions to get there. Instead, I don't have this final goal, and I just freely explore, and then I retrospectively evaluate what happened and see if that was interesting or not. So what I'm trying to say is curiosity finally, because we live in neuroscience in the era of prediction. Everything is about predictions and prediction error minimization and so on and so forth. Is there a way here in curiosity research to claim that it's not always all about prediction and prediction error minimization? You see where I'm trying to go here?
Making predictions, measurable predictions, is an essential ingredient for everything I said, but it's by far not at all the full picture. In the sense that here, again, what's important is that predictions that we are considering are not about goals imposed by the environment. They are about goals that are self-generated, and the process of self-generating and sampling those goals itself is extremely important to understand the way curiosity is working. And also, what's very important is the dynamics, the time dynamics of the evolution of prediction errors. So the derivative and the learning progress.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that if we are not considering this time dynamics, we might be missing very important aspect of the mechanism of exploration and learning.
Okay, I'll try to push you further here. So do you think that we can also think of curiosity as a way to drive behavior that is not goal-directed? So in a way, you are saying, okay, this is intrinsically motivated behavior, but can we also think of ways of motivating ourselves without having a intrinsically generated goal? So can we think, you see, like, for the sake of it, for pleasure, for entertainment, for, yeah.
Okay, let me answer in 3 ways to what you said.
Yeah.
First of all, it's actually one mechanism I did not describe so much here, but we worked in the past, is that you can use the learning progress idea to drive exploration of an individual without the notion of goals, only with the notion of a forward predictive model of the world. And the idea here is that you would use a reinforcement learning system that would reward the organism when it finds itself in states which provide information that leads to improvement of predictions of the world. And if you do that, you don't need at all to have any kind of notion of goal. But what I discussed today is the notion of autotelic exploration, where there is another way to organize exploration, is to explicitly generate representation of a future configuration of the world that I call a goal, that might be pretty abstract, that can be expressed in language, that could be draw a cat bus stuff, but that's an explicit representation of the world in the future that the organism set for itself. And learning progress is about progress in trying to achieve that goal. And I did not explain that in detail today, but we've been really comparing those two kind of approaches with machines in the last decade. And by very, very, very far, autotelic exploration is way more efficient than exploring based on just improving the forward model of the world. A large part of the machine learning community actually did not yet get that message, and they still use very traditional models of curiosity based on improving forward prediction of the world. This is way less efficient. And then, last part of answer of your question is that there is some kind of meta goal we are also always considering here, whether we are improving the forward model of the world or trying to make progress towards self-generated goals. This is the meta-objective of improving, making improvement either in the forward model of the world or either in the skills and control of the world. And whether you want to call that a goal or not is just a terminology question, but that's kind of a meta-objective.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this great talk. And let me, because there are many psychologists, let me just express my internal psychological state. When I hear you speaking, I have a mixture of admiration and frustration. And so I speak about the frustration here because the admiration is very evident from what you say. And the frustration comes from that. You presented a lot of let me put it the question really sort of defined and then I justify it. The question is to what extent what you proposed can be used by somebody who does cognitive psychology to understand the exact frame in which it is useful. Okay? So you presented it a very general, broad framework, and you gave examples that I think really don't work the way in which the literature in, for example, developmental language suggests. Let me take the example of the learning, the babbling infants. No? It's very well known that production comes way after perceptual systems have already been set up, and we know that infants, even in utero, already have a lot of quite detailed knowledge about certain kind of sounds of language that they never heard before, like, for example, differences between consonant and vowels. And it's also very well known that these kind of differences, I mean, these kind of discriminations are already active and liable to modifications which are really pharmacological modifications. So infants of mothers who have taken depressive treatment during pregnancy, they really will have a different kind of learning of the production course because it is connected with the fixation of some, let's say, critical periods in which certain kind of experiences can be used. So there, I don't think it's needed to just push your system. Let me give you another example. I don't think that kids need to learn that language is a communicative system. There is evidence that even at birth they need these things. And there are many concepts, like, for example, mathematical concepts, that kids don't need to learn. So I think that there is a sense in which I perceive, that's where the frustration comes from, an overextension of what you're saying, that asks me, okay, why not? So Josh Tenenbaum, a time ago, had an article which was basically saying, if you really want to make progress in artificial intelligence, the very first no, but one of the things that you need to do is to set up a model of the baby. Then from there on, you just set up your system. And my feeling is that if there were some more integration of this kind of approach with what you're saying, there would be a huge progress. And I have some sort of perception that sometimes what you suggest is not needed because there are biological mechanisms that take care of it. So the question that I want to ask you is, given this kind of framework, is the following. Where would you put the difference between a human and an animal in your system? Because there are animals who are born and they start running away like gazelles. They don't need to learn it. And we are the same for language, I would tend to say. We may disagree. But for many other things, of course, we are very different from. So what exactly what you suggest can explain in the general picture of the fact that we are very different from other animals?
Okay, thank you for the that's a very interesting question and perspective. So first of all, short comment about the vocal development. I know very well the literature on the development of perception of speech, which is preceding production, and that's completely compatible with the story I presented here. Here, that's really a model of the development of production, not of perception. And actually here, the agent is manipulating a space of representation of sounds, which might be progressively learned or might be innate, whatever it is, to represent the sound of the social peers. And basically what's happening here is completely orthogonal to the development of perception. That's really the development of production that relies here, actually here in that experiment, we do assume some representation of speech sounds, which needs to be there to generate the goals. And whether they are the result of innate abilities or they are learned is neutral to the story. So that's the first thing. And that actually, that particular example applies to all the other experiments I've been showing. For example, in the experiment with these robots, I did not use the word innate, but I said at the start, the robot is equipped with a number of ingredients for predicting movements, for perceiving the world, for learning particular regularities, and the ingredients it's using for learning the regularities, it's not nothing. It's a whole set of complicated mechanisms. I said it's also equipped with a particular architecture for measuring learning progress, for selecting goals based on that. So it's equipped with a lot of kind of innate, if you want, ingredients. And I'm not saying in this experiment where they come from. They are here from the start. So first of all the experiments I presented are compatible with the idea that you don't start from nothing. You always start from something. But the key question I'm asking here is that given a starter kit, if you want to speak about a starter kit, given a starter kit, how do you start from it to go towards the open-ended learning and development we observe in humans? So how do you get further? And then indeed, in some of the experiments, sometimes there are things that I do not assume, and that some researchers in cognitive science say they are already there from the start. But I would return your argument. I would say, I try to push this argument to show that sometimes some mechanisms that people assume are innate, you don't need that assumption. It comes spontaneously from other innate mechanisms, but that are a bit more generic. And my perspective is that what I'm trying to do is push forward a theoretical perspective to enable, provide the conceptual and the modeling tools to understand actually a little bit better, one, how you go further from a starter kit, whatever it is, and do we really need all the ingredients of starter kit 1 or 2 or 3 to account for development? Yeah. Here I only have wide speculations, but one of my intuitive ideas is that actually one difference is probably the sophistication of the motivational mechanisms, of the curiosity mechanisms, which I believe is way more, I think spontaneous exploration is way more expressed in human children than in a number of other animals, in terms of systematic design and exploration of new games, for example. And I believe this has to say, this relates not only to the, for example, to the weights of, for example, at some point I presented a model with different components of internal utility function just for curiosity. And one component was learning progress. And I believe that it's particularly prominent in humans compared to other animals. But the other thing that might be actually even more important is that here I'm focusing on only one part of the motivational system, but the motivational system is much richer. There are strong and organized motivational systems for finding food, for social recognition, for bonding, etc. And probably there are complicated arbitration mechanisms which work differently in different species. And last, I believe there is also an important role of cultural evolution. And humans have progressively developed societies in which children grow in an environment where there is a certain security to express their curiosity and their exploration, which might not be the case so much in other species. Maybe not fully for biological reasons, maybe because even some species who have the capability for primitive forms of cultural evolution did not yet reach a stage where the young have such a safe environment for exploration. These are speculations, complete speculations.